On the archival film, the door moves, not in a gust of wind, not from the shifting of an old house, but like lungs, expanding, contracting, slow, wet. The camera operator whispers, "Do you hear that?" before the tape cuts into static. Beneath that static, almost imperceptible, scholars claim you can hear a single word dragged across the dark: Jackson. This footage, found sealed in a mislabeled evidence box in 1937, was recovered from the ruins of the Cedar Reaches Orphanage in western Mississippi. The investigators who discovered it never filed a final report. 3 disappeared. The 2 who survived refused to speak again except to say, "We opened something we should have left buried. Tonight we descend into that burial." What you're about to hear has been pieced together from parish ledgers, unredacted seminary correspondences, plantation assessments, confiscated sermons, and one torn field diary written in a trembling hand. Together they tell a single story, one America tried to erase, a myth, a warning, a name whispered like a bruise: Moses Jackson. Across the Deep South, he was spoken of only under breath. They said he could bend men the way overseers bent the enslaved, force them to couple, choke, fight, obey. They said 9 white masters once chained themselves inside a granary at his command and emerged changed, or didn't emerge at all. No historian claims this is proven fact. But the institutions that suppressed these accounts, the seminary boards, the parish archives, the reconstruction tribunals, destroyed so much documentation that a darker truth seems more likely. Something happened. Something monstrous. Something built on suffering older than the Republic itself. And Cedar Reaches Orphanage, long after emancipation, remained its quiet shrine. The earliest reference to Moses Jackson appears not in plantation records, but in the 1894 Orphanage Ledger, page 117. The Incairn Gull bleeds through the aging paper. The entry is simple: new arrival, male, approx 60, no birthplace, no speech, eyes reflect light at unnatural angles, house matron advises isolation. Orphanages in the late 19th century routinely housed elderly individuals with no family, but Cedar Reaches was different. It existed under the authority of a rural seminary, funded by the Everettsburg First Church, whose pastors believed deeply in moral correction. Children were their chief subjects. Adults were tolerated if they could be reformed. But Moses, he came to them shackled. The sheriff who delivered him left no explanation, only an unsigned parchment scorched at the edges. The matron's later testimony, sealed, then lost in a fire, suggests he was found at the collapsed remains of a plantation miles away. She described him as silent, unmoving, as if the world pressed too loudly upon him. Within days, children reported scratching noises beneath the floorboards. Within weeks, the chapel bell rang at midnight. Within months, 6 of the 9 seminary instructors resigned, citing undue influence upon the mind. And yet, Jackson never spoke. The orphans drew pictures of him, a tall figure standing in a corner, face obscured. But what disturbed archivists was the pattern repeated in every sketch: circles, spirals, seeds, knots, symbols that predated the plantation era. Symbols appearing in West African spiritual traditions long before they were perverted by American slavery. Researchers would later call these markings cycles. The last matron called them instructions. Whatever Moses Jackson brought with him to Cedar Reaches, it didn't start there. It started back on the fields, long before the Civil War, where cruelty metastasized into something older, more deliberate and hungry. Local folklore insists Moses Jackson was the last survivor of Red Hollow Plantation, an estate erased from official maps after 1863. But oral histories persisted. They spoke of 9 owners, brothers, cousins, and business partners, who purchased human lives with the cold efficiency of accountants. The story goes they forced a horrific ritual on the enslaved, daily breeding cycles, where reproduction was treated not as life, but as inventory. In Red Hollow's ledgers, found decades later in a flooded root cellar, human names are reduced to initials, births marked as yield, mothers categorized as productive or deficient. But on an unnumbered page, written in frantic hand, is a chilling line: he watches, Scholars believe this refers to Jackson, then a young man. Other fragments describe him differently. His silence oppresses the air, eyes like lanterns in a tunnel. The men fear him more than the slaves do. The 9 masters grew paranoid. Whether from guilt, madness, or something Jackson radiated, no one can say. One diary mentions waking to find themselves standing in the breeding barn at dawn, hands shaking, breath sour with dread. Another wrote, "We are compelled now, as we compelled them. Our legs move without our will." The plantation population recorded a surge. Dozens of pregnancies across the enslaved community, but also among the master's own households. Quarreling, hallucinations, and violent infighting consumed them. Then, the final entry, "We cannot resist his direction. We are 9. He makes 9 of us every sunrise." 3 weeks later, Red Hallow was found burned to the soil. Only one man walked out alive, and he never spoke another word. By 1895, Cedar Reaches Seminary had begun recording incidents that faculty referred to as Jackson events. Most of these testimonies were locked away, classified as spiritual disturbances, but blueprints and confession logs survived reconstruction. Professor A. Hadley writes, "He does not move, yet somehow stands closer each time I look." Another instructor complained of dreams where a tall figure hovered over their bed, breathing with such slow rhythm that the dreamer's lungs matched it involuntarily. Upon waking, they found circular grooves carved into the wooden floor, etched by fingernails, not theirs. The most damning testimony comes from seminarian Thomas Virgil. "It is not what he does. It is what he makes us remember. Memories not ours, screams not ours, bloodlines we never carried. He drags us through them like a plow drags soil." Virgil withdrew from the seminary weeks later and died in self-exile, raving about the 9th cycle. What terrified the seminarians wasn't violence. Jackson never lifted a hand. It was the return. The feeling that a buried history, America's deepest sin, was resurfacing through someone who had lived it, survived it, and become fused with it in unspeakable ways. Some seminarians reported hearing hymns echoing through the hallways in a language they didn't know but felt they should. Others claimed he made them experience flashes of plantation life. Children ripped from mothers, punishments carried out beneath a merciless sun, nights filled with forced rituals masked as custom. None of them believed Jackson was merely human anymore. One wrote, "He became the memory became him, and memory, once awakened, feeds. The seminary tried to contain him, but you cannot contain a past that was built on containment itself." Matron Eleanor Brandt kept a personal journal, faded blue cloth cover, pages warped from humidity. Found decades after her death, it reveals the unraveling of Cedar Reaches from the inside. Brandt describes the night she first heard the chapel bell ring at midnight. She entered the sanctuary to find every orphan kneeling in rows, facing the pulpit, swaying in a slow, synchronized rhythm. Jackson stood at the aisle's end, still as a statue. No child recalled this the next day. In one entry, Brandt writes, "He does not speak, yet commands, commands without sound, commands without desire, like an echo of something done to him, now reflected back into the world." She noticed a transformation in the children. Their drawings grew more detailed, spirals, knots, and branching roots. They began using archaic phrases the matron couldn't place. Some whispered about being chosen for the 9th morning. Brandt documented her fear with shaky handwriting. "The children adore him, they fear him, I cannot tell the difference." Her most disturbing discovery came when she checked the storeroom and found that the children had arranged cornmeal, stones, and broken toys into a precise circular pattern, matching symbols found in suppressed West African spiritual texts and plantation folklore. Jackson stood in the center of it. Brandt claims that when she tried to pull one child away, she felt an overwhelming pressure, like the weight of centuries, forcing her knees to buckle. She writes, "When I looked up, I saw generations behind him, all staring through him, all staring at me." Her final journal entry ends mid-sentence, "The 9th is upon us. The doors have begun." The rest of the page is smeared as if wiped clean by a wet hand. In 1901, one orphan, Samuel Pierce, age 11, was adopted by a Methodist pastor in Alabama. Years later, Pierce would write his own memoir Under the Bell Tower, which the church refused to publish. He described Moses Jackson not with hatred, but with bewildered awe. He carried a gravity. Being near him felt like leaning toward a well so deep you hear stories echoing up from below. Pierce recalled episodes the matron never recorded. Nights when every child woke simultaneously. Moments where the air in the dormitory grew dense, as if filled with invisible hands pressing downward. Whispers threading through the rafters even when no one spoke. Most harrowing was the event he called the repetition. For 9 nights straight, the children found themselves standing in the courtyard before dawn without memory of walking there. They arranged themselves in lines, backs straight, hands clasped, unnervingly similar to slave auction positioning. Jackson stood before them. Pierce claimed his fellow orphans didn't understand the meaning of what they mimicked, but something in their bodies remembered. It was like we were acting out an inheritance we never received, he wrote, or perhaps an inheritance Jackson pushed into us. Pierce confessed he saw visions, brief flashes, during these rituals. A woman screaming into a field, a rope swinging from an oak, a horse collapsing under the weight of a bleeding rider, 9 shadows circling a barn. He would wake from these visions crying without knowing why. Pierce's pastor burned the memoir manuscript, but fragments survived in archived letters. His last line is the most chilling. He wasn't teaching us, he was remembering through us, and memory, once planted, grows even in children who do not belong to the soil where it was born. Reverend Nathaniel Mallory served as Cedar Reach's spiritual authority from 1890 to 1904. Initially confident, stern, and proudly aligned with postbellum moral restoration, he became a living ruin in his final years, haunted, skeletal, terrified of shadows. The cause: 13 sermons the church deleted from its archives. Only 2 transcripts remain, but whispers insist all 13 revolved around the same theme: the wages of unatoned cruelty. Mallory claimed Cedar Reaches was built atop the buried quarters of an earlier plantation, one that had burned before records existed. He described how he found charred bones and rusted shackles in a crawlspace beneath the seminary, but the most controversial sermon details his encounters with Jackson, whom he believed was divinely afflicted, a vessel holding the screams of a people. Mallory writes, "I looked upon him and felt the judgment of generations, not God's judgment, but something older, shaped by the hands of men who believed in dominion over flesh." He warned the church that Jackson carried a history that demanded reflection. When ignored, it demanded repetition. When resisted, it demanded transformation. Mallory insisted the 9 masters weren't commanded by Jackson. They reenacted their own sins under the weight of the trauma they inflicted, turned inward, devouring them. Jackson is the mirror, the reflection is what they feared. The church silenced him swiftly, but after his removal, Mallory reportedly spent his remaining years wandering Mississippi backroads, offering frantic warnings to strangers: beware the cycles. 9 mornings bring 9 reckonings. Memory does not die, it waits. On the night he died, witnesses claim the chapel bell at Cedar Reaches rang. No one was inside to pull the rope. In 1923, during restoration of the orphanage grounds, workers unearthed a series of wooden planks buried beneath 6 inches of soil. Their surfaces were carved with names, not of staff or children, but of enslaved people from long, destroyed plantations. The carvings were arranged in a perfect spiral, each name repeated 9 times. Experts identified several from Red Hallow's surviving ledgers, confirming the spiral's connection to Jackson's past. Some names matched abolitionist testimonies documenting brutal breeding practices. Others belonged to individuals who vanished entirely from public record, erased as if they had never existed. But the disturbing part wasn't the repetition. It was the way the names deepened as they approached the center. The outermost layer looked carved with a knife. The inner rings, however, were gouged with such force that the wood splintered and darkened. Analysts suggested fingernails, human ones, dug the deepest marks. Who carved them? Some argued the enslaved did it as a hidden memorial. Others believed the masters forced them to record their own existence as stock. Still others wondered if the carvings happened long after the plantation's destruction, because the final name, at the spiral's center, is not historical. It appears nowhere in any archive. It is carved only once, but so violently the wood nearly snaps. Moses Jackson. The spiral suggests a progression inward, as if Jackson were the culmination of something, a focal point of generational suffering. Some theologians propose the spiral represents transformation, the consuming of past atrocities by a vessel who internalized them. Folklorists argue the opposite. The spiral was a trap, a cage, a place to contain him. But if it was meant to bind Jackson, it failed, because through cedar reaches, through the orphanage, through the seminary, his influence grew again, spreading in whispers, rituals, and dreams. Cycles always return. Between 1904 and 1911, all records regarding Moses Jackson disappear. 7 years erased. Cedar Reaches continued operating, but Jackson's name vanishes from attendance lists, census logs, church rosters, even meal inventories. Researchers propose 3 theories. 1. He died quietly, buried in an unmarked grave. Impossible. Too many later testimonies reference him. 2. He escaped. Unlikely. Surrounding towns kept detailed reports of strangers, especially black men, during the Jim Crow era. 3. The seminary hid him. Most probable, and most horrifying, speculation arises from an architectural anomaly discovered decades later. A sealed wing beneath the orphanage basement, bricked over and undocumented. Inside lay rusted bed frames, a crumbling hymnal, and scratch marks covering every reachable surface. Some scratches formed words, repeated, obsessive, "We are the 9, repeat what was done to us, remember." Historians believe Jackson wasn't imprisoned, he was preserved. Kept in isolation, studied privately by a circle of elite pastors fascinated by his spiritual influence. They viewed him not as a victim of America's atrocities, but as a supernatural anomaly, a creature shaped by suffering, capable of transmitting collective memory through proximity. But confinement didn't weaken him, it intensified him. Townsfolk later spoke of nighttime chanting drifting from the orphanage windows, low, rhythmic, and rising in volume only to collapse into eerie silence. Children reported seeing a tall shadow seated at the edge of their beds, and then, inexplicably, Jackson reappears in the 1912 annual census, listed not as inmate or ward, but as resident witness. No explanation. No category, just that title. It suggests the seminary no longer tried to restrain him. They began listening. Whatever Jackson became during those missing years, the church feared it and needed it, a dangerous combination. On July 18, 1912, Cedar Reaches hosted a revival, advertised as a night of healing and moral renewal. Hundreds attended, filling the field behind the orphanage with lanterns, hymn books, and folding chairs. The event began like any other. Prayers, songs, testimonies, then the wind died, not slowed, stopped. Witness accounts describe an unnerving stillness as if the air held its breath. Lantern flames froze, motionless despite the summer heat. The crowd fell into instinctive silence. Jackson stepped into the center of the gathering. No one invited him. No one escorted him. One moment he wasn't there. The next he was standing among them like a memory forced into flesh. Eyewitnesses describe a strange pull, a compulsion to watch him, to breathe in sync with him. And then the singing began, but not from the choir, from the crowd. Hundreds of voices chanting a low, circular melody. A melody ethnomusicologists later identified as structurally similar to West African morning songs, though none of the attendees had heard it before. Reverend Mallory's replacement, Pastor Charles H. Lampton, tried to interrupt the chant. Witnesses say he froze mid-step, trembling, eyes fixed on Jackson. The congregation swayed, rhythmic, synchronized, entranced. Some began weeping. Others fell to their knees. A handful clawed at their chests, whispering, "It's coming back, it's coming back," though none could explain what it was. Then Jackson raised his hand. The chanting stopped instantly. What followed remains the most disputed part. Several sworn affidavits mention seeing 9 dark figures standing behind Jackson, translucent, tall, and flickering like flame shadows. The revival ended abruptly. People fled. Cedar Reaches closed its doors for 3 days. When it reopened, no one spoke of that night again. But in private letters, Pastor Lambton wrote, "He showed us what cannot be buried, and now it grows." After the revival night, the seminary experienced what internal documents refer to as the collapse year. In less than 12 months, enrollment plunged, teachers resigned en masse. Rumors spread through Everettsburg that Cedar Reaches had become bewitched. But the official cause was psychological, at least on paper. Seminarian journals reveal a pattern of deteriorating mental states, insomnia, hallucinations, terrifying dreams of fields soaked in moonlight, nightmares of birthing rooms filled with screams. One seminarian, Jonah Red, wrote, "When I pray, I hear other prayers underneath mine, prayers I do not recognize, spoken by voices cracked from hunger." Another reported waking to find his hands covered in soil, though his dormitory was on the 2nd floor. A third swore he heard babies crying beneath the chapel floor. A cluster of students began drawing the spiral symbol compulsively, in margins on desks on walls. Some described feeling pulled toward Jackson, as if gravity itself had shifted. A confidential church memo describes the situation bluntly. Exposure to subject J correlates with intrusive recollections not native to the individual, trauma transference, demonology, psychological contagion. Further investigation halted due to risk. The seminary attempted to relocate Jackson to an infirmary in a nearby town, but he refused to move, not physically. He simply stood still, and the 5 men tasked with carrying him could not lift him. They reported feeling an impossible weight, though Jackson remained thin, elderly, frail-looking. By spring 1913, 9 seminarians disappeared. An overturned lantern, a broken pew, and scattered hymnals were the only signs of struggle. Authorities searched for weeks. They found nothing, but in the sealed basement wing, 9 new scratch marks appeared along the brick walls, deep, parallel, and fresh. Between 1914 and 1916, 12 orphans vanished from Cedar Reaches without explanation. Their beds remained neatly made, their shoes lined up, no signs of escape or intrusion, only one clue. Each child had drawn a spiral on their pillowcase in charcoal. Authorities labeled them runaways. Newspapers refused to report on it, citing superstition. But internal memos among orphanage staff reveal a different truth. The children vanished during storms. Every disappearance occurred on a night when lightning struck the chapel's cross. 9 strikes in total over 2 years. Matron Josephine Clay, who replaced Eleanor Brandt, kept detailed notes. Before each storm, the children gather at the east windows. They hum a melody I have heard nowhere else. They speak the name Jackson with reverence, as if answering a call. Clay also reported seeing Jackson near the dormitories at night, though staff swore he never left the chapel alcove where he spent most of his days standing motionless. One orphan, Nathaniel Briggs, age 8, disappeared weeks before he was to be adopted. His adoptive family arrived to meet him only to find his bed empty and a message scratched into the wooden frame. "The 9th morning is coming." Clay resigned shortly afterward, leaving a final statement for the board. He is not taking them. They are going to him. Town rumor held that children spoke of fields calling their names, of families buried beneath the orphanage, and of returning to a place we never lived. Some folklorists believe the children were not abducted, but absorbed, drawn into the generational echo that followed Jackson everywhere. Whatever happened, one fact is undeniable. The disappearances stopped the moment Jackson left Cedar Reaches for the final time. In 1917, after mounting concerns from local residents, the Department of Interior dispatched investigator Frederick Alden to assess Cedar Reaches for cultural anomalies and unsafe conditions. Alden's report, declassified in 1974, reads less like an inspection and more like a descent into psychological dissolution. He describes arriving at the orphanage to find the grounds eerily silent, children avoiding his gaze, staff speaking in hushed tones, and an overwhelming odor of damp wood and something older, something metallic. But Alden's greatest interest was the basement. He writes, "The temperature drops 10 degrees, the air feels heavy, wrong, the walls bear finger gouges, thousands of them, layered as though carved over decades." He found a locked chamber reinforced with iron bands. The lock was warm to the touch. Inside, he expected a prisoner. Instead, he found symbols, spirals, circles, names, covering every surface. At the center stood a single wooden chair, worn smooth as if countless people had sat in it. Alden noted it faced a blank brick wall, but when he moved his lamp he saw something else. 9 shadows on the wall, cast by a single figure. Only one person stood in the room, Moses Jackson. Alden fled. His final entry reads, "He carries them, the 9, the masters, the enslaved, the children, all bound together in him like rings in a tree trunk. When he looks at you, he asks one question without speaking. Will you remember what they erased?" Days later, Alden resigned, citing moral injury. And night terrors. Federal interest abruptly ceased. Cedar Reaches was declared stable. The seminary insisted Jackson was harmless, but Alden's closing remark suggests otherwise. Harmless is what you call the thing you cannot stop. The phrase "ninth morning" appears repeatedly across testimonies, journals, and carvings. But what did it signify? Folklorist Dr. Miriam Elwood proposed it symbolized the 9th cycle of generational trauma, the point at which unhealed suffering erupts into active memory. In plantation superstition, the 9th sunrise after a major ordeal was believed to reopen history. But at Cedar Reaches, the 9th morning became literal. On January 9, 1918, at dawn, the chapel bell rang 9 times. The rope frayed mid-ring, snapping with such force it left scorch marks on the stone floor. Outside, the children stood in perfect formation, rows and columns, facing the rising sun. Staff members tried to intervene but found their legs frozen, breath shallow, minds overwhelmed by vivid flashes of fields, chains, and screams. Jackson stood at the front. Witnesses claim he raised his hand, and the wind howled. The trees bent. The orphanage shutters slammed violently. Then the children sang, not a hymn, not English, something older. Audio recordings made by a nearby civilian, though degraded, reveal a rhythmic chant matching patterns found in West African lament traditions, fused with harmonic structures resembling black church spirituals of the Reconstruction era. The perfect merging of stolen heritage with manufactured faith. The 9th morning was not a ritual Jackson created. It was a ritual America had forced into being long before he was born. Jackson merely returned it. When the chant ended, dozens collapsed, some convulsed, others wept uncontrollably. A few laughed, high, broken laughs of people whose reality had cracked. But the most chilling detail, after that day, every child aged 9 or older bore a small circular scar over their heart. No one could explain how it appeared, and Jackson, without a word, walked out of Cedar Reaches. After the 9th morning, Jackson began walking, simply walking, north along the river. Witnesses saw him pass through towns without stopping, without eating, without resting. People followed him, children, strangers, farmhands, widows, sharecroppers, white families who claimed their ancestors felt called. Some followed for hours before collapsing in exhaustion. Others trailed him for days. He left no footprints, no trail, no explanation. Local newspapers called it the Exodus, mocking it as mass hysteria, but multiple photographs confirm a silent procession eclipsing entire roads. No one recalled choosing to follow him. They only remembered the feeling, like being pulled by a memory that didn't belong to you. A Baptist minister claimed Jackson walked with the posture of a grief older than God. A shopkeeper swore he saw 9 shadows walking behind him, stretching impossibly long at noon. Some followers reported visions, plantation cabins collapsing, chains sinking into soil, hands rising from the earth, not seeking salvation but recognition. The exodus ended abruptly near the ruins of Red Hollow Plantation, the place where Jackson's story began. There he stood among the scorched remains. His followers gathered around him, forming a vast circle. For hours, nothing happened. Then Jackson knelt, pressed his palm into the burnt ground, and exhaled. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, like a chorus of distant voices rising through the soil. Those present described the sensation as unbearable. It was like hearing every cry ever swallowed by this land. When Jackson rose, he looked hollow, emptied, as if he had poured out all that lived inside him. He walked away alone. The followers dispersed, dazed, some unable to recall why they were there. But each reported the same dream that night, a spiral expanding. It had only begun. After the exodus, Jackson vanished for 3 years. No sightings, no records, but evidence suggests his presence was felt. Quietly, deeply across the South, communities reported strange phenomena, church services interrupted by spontaneous weeping, families discovering old plantation ledgers hidden in their attics, children speaking names of ancestors no one told them about, white landowners having identical nightmares of fields burning in perfect spirals. And then there were the sounds. Residents across Mississippi and Alabama reported hearing faint rhythmic tapping at night, like fingernails on wood. Coming from beneath their homes, some heard humming. A few heard whispering. Historians believe Jackson's disappearance wasn't absence. It was diffusion. He became less a person and more a force, a concentrated embodiment of memory seeking acknowledgement. One remarkable incident occurred in the town of Brecklin, where 9 church deacons collapsed simultaneously during a meeting about maintaining racial order. When revived, each described visions of themselves forced to reenact the daily rituals inflicted on enslaved people, a reversal of roles that left them trembling. Medical reports listed the cause as collective hysteria. But one nurse overheard a deacon mutter, "He was there, the silent one, he made us feel." Meanwhile, schools, churches, and civic groups began quietly destroying plantation-era documents. Some burned them. Others buried them. The intent was clear: erase the past before it erupted again. But trauma does not disappear through denial. It festers. During this silent winter, the phrase "ninth morning" appeared graffitied on walls, carved into trees, and scratched into the paint of abandoned barns. Communities tried to paint over it. It reappeared. By 1922, whispers suggested Jackson was preparing something final. The 9th morning was only the warning. What came next would be the reckoning. In the autumn of 1923, without announcement, Jackson returned to Cedar Reaches. Older, thinner, moving with deliberate heaviness. Surviving staff described feeling punched in the chest the moment they saw him. But the orphanage had changed. Enrollment dwindled. Funding dried up. The chapel stood cracked and leaning. The seminary wing was condemned after the collapse of a supporting wall. Jackson wandered through each building as if walking through memories. He lingered in the dormitory, touching the empty beds. He stood at the pulpit, staring at the bell rope. He traced the spiral carved into the chapel pew. When he entered the sealed basement, several staff followed, though none remembered choosing to. Inside, they found the walls crumbling, the air thick with mildew, and new scratch marks, fresh ones, still damp. Jackson approached the chair in the center. The staff collapsed, clutching their chests, gasping. Some screamed. Others froze in silent horror. One described the moment as being crushed by a truth I'd spent my whole life ignoring. Jackson sat in the chair. Staff recounted seeing blurry shapes swirling behind him, figures composed of dust and memory. One identified them as enslaved individuals based on clothing. Another insisted they were the 9 masters. A third claimed they saw both merging. The room grew unbearably cold. Jackson closed his eyes. The lights flickered, and every clock on the campus stopped at the same minute. 9:09. When the lights returned, Jackson was gone. But in his place, carved deep into the chair, was a single message: "Do not let them forget." Cedar Reaches shut down permanently weeks later. But the story was not over. Something had been released. In 1931, journalist Harriet Cole began researching the Cedar Reaches disappearances. Fascinated by the secrecy surrounding the orphanage, she tracked down former staff, seminarians, and townsfolk. Most refused to speak. Others broke down in tears. One slammed the door, shouting, "You don't want to carry this." But Cole persisted. Her notes reveal a pattern in the testimonies. Everyone exposed to Jackson, directly or indirectly, experienced recurring visions of hands reaching from the soil. Everyone reported hearing rhythmic breathing at night. Everyone described a sensation of falling into memories not their own. Cole visited the ruins of Red Hollow, the site of the Exodus. She felt the ground throb beneath her feet, like a slow heartbeat. Locals warned her not to stay after dark. She stayed anyway. Her journal's final entry describes a chilling encounter. I saw him, not with my eyes, but in the space behind them. The silence around him is unbearable. It is the silence of stories buried alive. He does not want revenge. He wants acknowledgement. Cole vanished shortly afterward. Her belongings were found beside the river, untouched except for her leather notebook. The last page contains a sketch, a spiral. At the center she wrote, "The ninth cycle is never the last. Trauma travels, and he is its messenger." Her disappearance sparked renewed interest in Cedar Reaches, but officials dismissed all supernatural claims. Yet intimidation followed. Researchers were threatened. Archivists lost their jobs. Church representatives pressured newspapers to avoid the story, because the truth was too dangerous. If Moses Jackson existed as described, he was more than a man. He was the living memory of America's original sin, made flesh, unstoppable, and returning whenever silence tried to suffocate history. Between 1933 and 1950, Jackson sightings spread across the country, not just in the South. Chicago, New York, Detroit, Pittsburgh, always the same description: tall, silent, unblinking, watching. Often near black neighborhoods during moments of racial tension. Police raids, redlining protests, labor disputes. Witnesses claimed his presence preceded eruptions of truth. Hidden records surfaced. Family secrets spilled. Generational pains resurfaced. One steelworker reported seeing Jackson on a rooftop the night before a violent clash. He didn't stop the violence. He made us see why it was happening. A schoolteacher in Harlem described him walking through the hallway during a segregation debate. Children fell silent, some cried, some hugged each other like they remembered something ancient. In 1946, a World War II veteran suffering from combat trauma claimed Jackson appeared in his hospital room. He showed me a memory that wasn't mine, a field, a whip, a scream, and then my own memories made sense. Pain recognizes pain. Psychologists dismiss these accounts as collective hallucination, but the consistency of the descriptions across states, decades, and demographics suggests otherwise. Then, in 1950, he appeared one final time. A farmer in Louisiana saw him standing at the edge of a cotton field at dawn. Jackson placed his hand on the soil, breathed deeply, and closed his eyes. When the farmer looked again, he was gone. Left behind in the dirt was a spiral, massive, precise, carved into the earth as though by invisible hands, and at its center lay a single rusted shackle. No footprints, no signs of a person, just the reminder: memory does not die. It waits. If the story of Moses Jackson seems impossible, ask yourself why. Is it the supernatural elements, or is it the idea that traumas, centuries deep, could become so heavy, so dense, so overwhelming that it shapes a life into something mythic? Something monstrous, something true. The institutions that tried to erase Jackson, fields, churches, orphanages, seminaries, were the same institutions built on enforced silence, and silence is fertile ground for legends born of suffering. Maybe Jackson wasn't a man who commanded 9 masters. Maybe he was the memory of every enslaved person they sought to control, concentrated, embodied, refusing to be forgotten. Maybe he didn't steal children. Maybe he awakened something in them, an ancestral ache that demanded recognition. Maybe he didn't haunt the South. Maybe the South haunted him. Moses Jackson is not a ghost. He is the echo of a truth America buried and hoped would rot. But memory does not rot. Memory grows. Every spiral found in the soil, every unexplained disappearance, every dream of hands reaching through time, every bell that rings when no one pulls the rope. These are not hauntings. They are warnings. The 9th morning was never a prophecy. It was a cycle that returns whenever truth is denied. The question is not whether Moses Jackson still walks the earth. The question is, what happens when the next cycle begins? When the buried past breathes again, and when the silence around us starts to feel alive, fade to black, bell tolls once, a second time, a third. You hold your breath, but the 9th ring never comes.